Hello, and welcome everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. I begin by acknowledging the historical territories of First Nations Treaties 6 and 7 and the traditional homeland of the Métis. My husband and daughter were Métis, so this recognition is very meaningful to me. I have been asked to introduce myself today, and I begin with saying I am the granddaughter of a British home child, one of the over 100,000 children sent from the United Kingdom to Canada as indentured farm workers and domestic servants. I first became interested in this history when I read a book review on this topic in the 1980s. Researching this history and these children has since been a lifelong pursuit. My background includes training in researching specific areas of history, the social sciences, law, culture, education, and genealogy. In 2013, I received my Master of Arts degree in Integrated Studies, and in 2017, I earned a certificate of genealogical studies. I am retired from my position as instructor in human services with Lakeland College and recently completed a contract with Northwest College. Some of my current activities include being a member of the Royal Canadian Legion, vice president of the Lloydminster and Area Brain Injury Society, and a member of 2 book clubs and a seniors advocacy group. I also hold memberships in several museums, research, and historical groups and genealogical forums. As a 12-year member and accredited speaker for Home Children Canada, it is my privilege to be speaking to you today on Canada's British home children, a topic for which I have great passion. I express my thanks to Kim Whiting of the library and to your mayor, Ken Johnston, and his executive assistant, Rochelle Sauvage, whose enthusiasm and interest made this presentation possible. Finally, I express my thanks to all the dedicated home children researchers and volunteers I have admired over the years, some of whom are no longer with us. From some of these individuals and close friends and family, I have received incredible support and encouragement, and I have listed them at the end of my PowerPoint. Now, because of the many years in which research has been carried out, there are differences in some of the information available. Much of it at some point was correct or the best information we had at the time. With this in mind, I have listed my primary resources at the conclusion of my presentation. Okay, let's begin. I am going to start by asking 3 questions. First, how many of you had ever heard the term British home child or knew very much before learning about today's presentation? How many of you know when National British Home Child Day is commemorated throughout throughout Canada? Hint, it's on the slide. That's right, September 28th. Finally, how many of you are descended from, related to, or think you might be related to a British home child? Well, for those of you who are unable to answer one or more of these questions, you are not alone. And that's why I'm taking us on a journey into a history about which most Canadians know very little, if anything at all. Yet it is estimated that 10%, or about 4 million Canadians, are descended from one or more of these children. And why don't most Canadians know about this history? Because many historians recorded very little until recently. Perhaps it was because they had no idea just how many children would be involved or how long this unique era of history would last. Or perhaps they placed little or no value on these children. Educators did not teach it because they themselves were not taught it, and children kept silent well into adulthood for many, and today you will find out why. For the most part, it is not a pretty history, nor a happy one, for it is full of hardships, hard labor, abuse of every kind, and feelings of hopelessness, loneliness, and shame. For many of us today, it is a difficult and emotional story to hear, but it is one that must be told, and thousands of descendants like myself are committed to making it more widely known. I am the proud descendant of a British home child, Grace Ruth Sillett, my paternal grandmother. And like most descendants, I had to learn about her childhood only after her death and through my interest in family research. I wanted to know why she came to Canada at the age of 10 without her family and on a ship with 176 other children. All she had ever told her children and her grandchildren was she came to Canada to be a companion to a rich little girl. So I knew I had to learn about a history I had never heard of before. So let's start that search in Canada. I begin by taking you back to November of 1869, an important date, for it was the beginning of the history of the British home children in our country. The place is the old courthouse in Niagara-on-the-Lake, Ontario. The event is the arrival from Britain of Maria Rye, philanthropist and a member of the growing social reform movement at that time. With her were 67 girls and 6 boys between the ages of 4 and 13, who would make the remodeled courthouse their temporary residence before being sent to live with and work for host families in the area. They called it Our Western Home, and it was the first of what came to be known as receiving or distributing homes in Canada for the thousands of children arriving from British immigration homes, receiving homes, orphanages, industrial schools, and workhouses, hence the term home children. The event and year are significant because it was the beginning of a specific child labor program that came to be called the Child Migration Scheme. It was overseen by a committee of the British Board of Guardians under the Poor Law Unions and financially supported by wealthy patrons, donations, religious and social groups, and the governments of Canada and the British Isles. It permitted 51 known organizations and individuals to bring impoverished, orphaned, and abandoned children to our shores from England, Scotland, Wales, the Republic of Ireland, Northern Ireland, and several surrounding islands, including the Isle of Man, the Channel Islands of Jersey and Guernsey, and the Isle of Wight. Shipping lines that brought the children to Canada often received a financial bonus for each child, and they sometimes carried upwards of 300 children on the same passage. It was a program that sent 100,000 and possibly as many as 115,000 boys and girls to Canada between 1869 and 1948. They were between 1 and 18 years of age, with an average age of 12. The children were indentured, or in other words, contracted out to work for Canadian host families as farm laborers, domestic servants, and sometimes as mothers' helpers, something like an older sister looking after younger siblings. A very few, especially the youngest, were informally or formally adopted by families prior to and after Canadian adoption laws. But for all others, their prospects were quite different. Sending organizations would advertise in Canada that there would be a group of children arriving on a certain date, and Canadians, mostly farmers, but also families in villages, towns, and cities, would then apply to the organizations for a child to work in their farm or in their home. This ad was placed in the Montreal Gazette in 1902 for a receiving home in Knowlton, Quebec. Quote, on the second instant, a party numbering 38 boys and girls arrived at Knowlton House from Liverpool. The older ones were readily placed, and homes are desired for several boys and girls between the ages of 3 and 9 years. The baby girl, 3 years old, is an attractive child. There was one girl, aged 7, from Scotland, and several boys, among the latter being 2 bright little Scotch brothers, aged 9 and 7. Photos may be had on application. Most organizations had the host family sign an indenture contract, including a payment to the organization of anywhere between 2 and 10 British pounds, or about $4 to $20 Canadian, for application and transport fees. In fact, because the children were under the care of these organizations, the actual contract was between the organization and the host family, and not with the child. Thus, most children had no say in where they went, or who they would work for, or what they would be paid. Now, depending on the requirements of each sending organization, some host families had to agree to be responsible for the child to attend school and church, and to receive good food and proper clothing while training the child to be a laborer or servant. Some children worked for their room and board, but this was not the norm. Because of the exchange of money to the organizations, this is where many people believe the children were sold into servitude or slavery. However, the difference is that at the end of the indenture, usually at the age of 18, or whenever a child left the placement, the child was to be paid for their labor. Unfortunately, it didn't always happen that way. And with some organizations, families were paid to look after a child until the age of 12, at which time the child would then begin to work for pay. There are records of this starting to occur in the early 1890s, particularly for boys in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. We will return to this a little later. However, there are records of children, particularly boys, doing a full day's hard labor as early as age 4. So, an important question to ask is, how did all of this even get started? Well, let's now go to Great Britain to see what had been happening there. Historically, child labor and child migration were long accepted practices in Britain and elsewhere in Europe. In fact, England had started to send children to work on farms in the American colonies, and on Dutch farms in Africa as early as the 1600s. As well, records prior to Confederation indicate that many children in Canada were also expected to work for wages as early as age 6 to help support the family. So sending children to Canada to work was readily accepted by some, at least initially. What was different with this plan from those earlier programs was the concentrated mass movement of thousands of children to Canada each year, away from their family, if they had one, away from their friends, culture, traditions, and any future prospects they might have had in their homeland, and that it was carried out by so many different organizations. In fact, one organization boasted in the British and Canadian newspapers that they had sent 1,000 children in 1 year alone. This was considered a great achievement and resulted in the organization receiving further donations to send over even more children. So what prompted such a scheme? As early as the 1820s, Britain's Industrial Revolution had brought about a society, especially in larger cities, filled with families who had moved from rural Britain. Few found work, while many met with injury, financial hardships, or illness, sometimes death, leaving behind their children who were abandoned or orphaned, and sometimes living on the streets. Some children were hired in factories. Many survived by being part of small groups of children, often living on the streets, or working for unscrupulous men and women who themselves were just attempting to survive. Even that early, there were politicians, particularly in England, who wanted to rid the cities of these children and their families. One way the government thought the poverty issue could be alleviated was through the enactment of a new poor law in 1834 and its subsequent amendments, some increasingly punitive. The concept of the workhouse was to provide relief, what we today call social assistance, to destitute individuals and families. Scotland also passed a poor law, but with some different criteria and expectations. By the way, the Old Poor Law of England was enacted in the mid-1500s, so it was definitely time for change. The government came up with the idea of workhouses, and they quickly began to be built in almost every district in England and then Scotland and elsewhere. Their initial purpose was to act as a deterrent to those who were capable of but did not want to work, or as a temporary shelter for those incapable of working or supporting themselves and their families. However, not only would a parent be placed in a workhouse, but all members of their family, and all were given jobs to pay their way, even the children. Poverty had become a national crisis in the world's most affluent country, and children suffered the most. This is a quote from Kenneth Bagnall. By the 1870s, there was an estimate that 1 out of 5 children in Great Britain lived in poverty, and even more out of that 5 were actually destitute. Now, by the late 1860s, Maria Rye had already started seeking support and financial assistance for an immigration plan to Canada. But she wasn't the only one. Annie McPherson, another person active in social reform, quote, walked into a filthy, dark house in which several children lived. She heard voices from the attic, and upon opening a hatch in the ceiling, found over 30 little girls, their arms thin as broomsticks, at work, making matches. Most were between the ages of 8 and 10, but some were even younger. Some of the youngest girls, whose job it was to place the phosphorus on the ends of the matchsticks, had fingers that were so badly burnt that their bones could be seen in their tiny fingers, unquote. McPherson reported her experience, and with the work already carried out by Maria Rye, persons in prominent positions in Britain reacted strongly and immediately. The timing seemed perfect to create a child labor transportation scheme. However, instead of being encouraging and positive, much of the response was filled with vitriol, disgust, and a sense of urgency to get it underway. However, there were government officials on both sides of the Atlantic, especially in Canada, who expressed strong reservations about child labor. Canada especially cited a conflict with the startup of labor unions, that children would be taking away the work of adults seeking work, and that the children would be doing adult work at a much lower wage. Despite the opposition, however, there were those in authority who wanted these and other destitute children removed not only from the streets, but from Great Britain entirely, calling them waifs, strays, wastrels, gutter snipes, street Arabs, and thieves, names that later followed and stigmatized home children in Canada for years to come. In fact, the cartoon on this slide became quite famous at the time, children being scooped up off the street with the trash and manure and thrown into the cart to be hauled away to Canada. This image also followed home children to Canada, scum, filth, slime, and the lowest of society. Interestingly, there were some small villages and communities in Britain that did not agree with the plan to send their local children to Canada, stating it was better for the child to remain in their home community, where they could be nurtured by in a familiar environment and with people who knew them. On the other hand, larger centers and the British government saw the immigration scheme as cost-effective. It was cheaper to send children to Canada than to provide for them in orphanages, special institutions, or workhouses. This thought became a common perception in class and money-conscious Britain, and financial support and plans for a migration scheme began in earnest. The rationalization was threefold. First, rid Britain of its supposedly unwanted children. Second, populate Canada by providing inexpensive labor to help build the colony. And third, with a growing British population, the British interests in North America would be protected against encroachment by the United States and their policy of manifest destiny. Now, rather than government taking responsibility for the development and follow-through of this child migration plan, it was decided philanthropic and religious organizations would be the avenues to fulfill these goals. For some organizations, there was a fourth rationale: prepare the children before being sent by providing them with some education, religious training, and work-related skills. By doing so, the thought was the children would be better prepared for their new lives in Canada, and the training they further received in Canada would provide them with more opportunities as adults. By the fall of 1869, Britain was on a mission, and that first group of children arrived in Canada with Rye, with a second group arriving only months later with Macpherson. Sending children would not end for 79 years. Within a few years, the migration scheme began to expand, and just not street children or orphans, but any impoverished child became a potential migrant. And it is a known fact, some organizations and individuals coerced and even kidnapped children when they were alone, seemed most vulnerable, or expressed an interest in Canada. In fact, Dr. Bernardo, the most well-known of the individuals who brought children to Canada, was charged and found guilty of what he called, quote, philanthropic kidnapping, unquote, believing that he had the right to remove children of any faith and Christian denomination from any setting and from parents he considered unsuitable or immoral. This practice led to a bitter conflict between Bernardo and the Catholic diocese in Great Britain, as he was taking Catholic children into his Protestant organization and into host families. Bernardo eventually gave way to the diocese and agreed to no longer take Catholic children into his care. This decision also ensured Catholic children would be placed in Catholic homes in Canada. Unfortunately, this led to many concerns, as most Catholics in Canada lived in Quebec and spoke French with little or no English. Overall, research has shown that it wasn't long before most of the children came from very poor or destitute families from all corners of the United Kingdom, and parents or guardians freely placed children in these benevolent organizations. For many families, other relatives were often in financial distress themselves and were unable to care for the children of another family member. And sometimes, when one spouse remarried, their new partner, frequently a new wife, did not want to be caring for children from a previous marriage. At the same time, parents continued to send their children in service or indenture them to employers in Great Britain who were seeking inexpensive labor. Parents also sold them into servitude to help reduce the financial burden on the family, at least temporarily. Excuse me. In fact, many of us may recall seeing drawings or pictures of small boys on ships or selling newspapers on corners, or little girls selling flowers or matches, or of seeing young children and teens working for wealthy families. For some parents, though, sending their children to Canada may have been viewed as offering better opportunities for one or more of their children. Yet, it is important to note that the majority of children throughout the United Kingdom that were taken into philanthropic care did remain in the United Kingdom. As children began to be admitted to these organizations, many more groups began to spring up throughout Great Britain. Parents had choices, but once they gave up a child, a parent might not have known that they might never see or get their child back again. And we have far too many documented stories where this indeed is what happened. Some of the most well-known philanthropists and organizations that also became prominent in Canada, along with Dr. Bernardo, Maria Rye, and Annie Macpherson, are the Burt sisters. They were actually Macpherson sisters. Fagans, Thomas Stevenson, and Middlemore Holmes, Marchmont Homes, Shaftesbury Homes, Warriors, Gibbs Homes, the Church of England Waifs and Strays Society, Church Army, the Catholic Emigration Society, and the Salvation Army. No matter what the origins of the children in the United Kingdom, those taken into philanthropic care were provided with needed medical treatment and the promised food, new clothing, some training in religion, education, and work skills, but also with the promise of a better future in the wide open spaces of Canada. It was suggested to the children that Canadian families would welcome them into their homes to be treated as a member of the family, eating proper healthy meals with the family, and enjoying friendships and participating in their new community, and all the while learning new skills. Boys dreamed of cowboys, the RCMP, and of horses and mountains, things that they read in books or had seen on posters. Girls dreamed of a nice home, nice clothing, making friends, and helping out with young children. Many children who had been asked if they wanted to go to Canada were eager and excited about their prospects, while others said they didn't want to go, but in reality, few children had a choice. So, headed with, small bags or suitcases and trunks neatly packed with clothing, a coat, shoes, boots, toiletries, a Bible, and sometimes a copy of the book, Pilgrim's Progress, all provided by the sending organizations, the great migration of children was underway and seemed intended for success. And in preparation for the many children that were going to be emigrated, the organizations had already begun to establish receiving homes in Canada. So let's move our story back to Canada to see what had been developing here. In the first 20 years up to the late 1880s, most receiving homes were located in southern Ontario, including Ottawa, Toronto, Belleville, Niagara-on-the-Lake, Stratford, and Peterborough. Soon, other homes, farms, and temporary shelters were established in Quebec, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and much later, 2 residences in British Columbia. Of particular interest for those of us in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta were settings in Winnipeg, Brandon, Russell, Indian Head, Melfort, Regina, Calgary, Edmonton, Sylvan Lake, and an orphanage in Prince Albert, as thousands more children arrived and were just dispersed throughout the country. What the children did not know was that very early on, it had been decided that there was to be little or no effort to keep the siblings together once in Canada. And the preference was that all connections to all family members was to be severed, despite some parents being told that they could contact their child once in Canada. Further, some children were told both their parents had died, even though this research has shown it was very rarely the case. The thought was that a child would be better able to begin a new life if they did not have to be concerned about parents who were still alive back in England or Scotland or elsewhere in the British Isles. Thus, because of these practices, most home children never had any contact with any family member ever again. Some children learned only many years later that a sibling had been living in the same or a nearby town, or went to the same church, and their sending organizations had never told them. But I'm jumping ahead. Let's take a step back once again to the earliest days when the child migration scheme got underway here. Despite some disagreements, the children and the organizations were welcomed by Canadians who sought inexpensive labor. Free land or buildings were granted to the receiving homes, and the organizations and gala fundraising events were often held in the larger cities. However, as time passed, the enthusiasm and welcome began to turn to suspicion, anger, and mistrust. Newspapers in Canada fueled these misgivings and concerns. Some insisted that organizations, in particular Maria Rye, were just out to make money, or not adhering to both Canadian and British government instructions and directions. Media was full of suggestions that the worst of Britain's children were being thrown into Canada. Thus, it was within only a few years after the scheme was underway that a report was requested by the London Committee in charge of the migration scheme. It was completed by a man called Andrew Doyle, who came to Canada to gather information on the organizations and how they carried out their programs. There were only a few organizations in Canada in the early 1870s that when he came over. However, Doyle concluded that children were being mistreated, improper records, especially financial, were being kept, and most organizations had little or no contact with the children once they were sent out to work for families. In fact, Maria Rye could not account for where most of her children were sent. She said she was just too busy to keep track. She and her supporters disagreed with the report and suggested Doyle had already made up his mind about what he was going to say and write in his report before even coming to Canada. Doyle made several recommendations for change, but his most significant was to discontinue the migration scheme. That recommendation and some others were totally ignored. On the other hand, Annie Macpherson immediately put some of the recommendations into action, and she became recognized as having one of, if not the most responsible, child program at that time. In the end, Doyle and his report were discredited, and child migration continued to grow. In fact, to encourage even more children being sent to Canada, the British government passed a law that permitted organizations to send children without parental or guardian permission and without their knowledge until after the ship set sail. If a parent wanted their child returned to them, they had to pay back the full cost after the child had been taken into care, including passage to and from Canada for those who had already been sent here. Needless to say, parents could not afford this for one child, let alone others of their children. Dr. Bernardo, whose organization became the largest, initially sent his children to Canada with Annie Macpherson. And when he set up his own arrangements in Canada in 1884, he complied with much of Doyle's recommendations, promising to send only his brightest, best behaved, and healthiest children. He made his records available for scrutiny, and then he began huge promotions of his organization in both Canada and Great Britain to reassure patrons, the government, donors, and prominent people of his commitment. Indeed, for all organizations, it was essential that patrons believed they were doing the right thing by donating money to help orphans and needy children. In fact, Bernardo's began using before and after photographs of children to urge people to donate, even though many of those before photos were staged. And he held special events called Waifs and Strays Days. Thus, even Bernardo made the children in his own organization feel a little belittled. It must have been difficult for a home child to be called Bernardo child. Just to note, Bernardo sent over 30,000 children, more than any other group. And as time went on, it was the Bernardo name that became synonymous with juvenile migrations to Canada. As a result, many home children to Canada began being called Bernardo boys or Bernardo girls, no matter what organization sent them. So you can imagine the confusion and frustration that this created for British home child researchers over the years. Despite changes made by Bernardo and other groups, there were always some prominent Canadian to condemn the home children and the organizations, even long after the migration scheme began and after most issues had been resolved. In the early 1890s, Frederick Nichols, a member of Parliament and a person holding many board positions in Canada, including in newspapers, described home children in this partial quote as waifs and strays that are tainted and corrupt with moral slime and filth inherited from parents and surroundings of the most foul and disgusting character. Dr. Menardo is dumping his human warts and excrescences upon Canada, unquote. No wonder the children remained silent. Enter the era of psychology. Dr. C.K. Clarke, considered the father of Canadian psychiatry, and for whom the Clarke Institute in Toronto was named, happened to be on the same train with some homeboys traveling to Winnipeg over 30 years after the scheme had actually begun. And he made this statement, quote, "In Canada, we are deliberately adding to the population hundreds of children bearing all the stigma of physical and mental degeneracy. A juvenile criminal here, an insane person there. The future has to be considered, but the harvest has already begun," unquote. These were some of his kinder words, and it is the perception that he taught to his psychology students at the University of Toronto, thereby perpetuating misinformation. We also have another example of how people can be influential, but this one is in a book of fiction. In the first chapter of Lucy Maud Montgomery's story, Anne of Green Gables, Aunt Marilla says she wants a boy to help her out on the farm, but not one of those homeboys, even though he might be nice. No, she wants a good Canadian-born boy because she would feel safer with him. So, if Aunt Marilla, a respected and upstanding woman in one of the world's most famous and beloved children's stories, did not feel safe with a homeboy, who could? Of course, we all know she ended up with a girl, and there are some who believe Anne was a British home child, but we may never know Montgomery's intentions. We also have the views of Charlotte Whitten, who was later to become the mayor of Ottawa 4 times. She, created the Canadian Council on Child Welfare in 1921. Yet, despite all the good that came from this organization over many years, Whitten's harsh initial and personal views were well known. She was against the child migration scheme, stating it brought the lowest of Britain's classes to Canada with, quote, "their degeneracy, low morality, and criminality," unquote. She stated in a 1928 report that most pregnant unmarried girls in Ontario were home girls. She didn't address how these girls, not women, but girls, got pregnant, or by whom. In fact, in a later report, an Ontario government official denied that most were British home children, but the damage was already done. Whitten supported sterilization of both men and women to prevent unwelcome pregnancies of those she considered unworthy, specifically all the poor people who came to Canada from the lowest classes in their home countries, including home children. Further, she was against family allowance, what we know today as child benefits, because she believed it would encourage the poor to have more babies in order to get more money from the government. All of this over 50 years after the child migration had begun, from one powerful woman who is supposed to be an advocate for all children and all families across the country. Again, is it any wonder why our home children ancestors were silent about their childhood? To add to all of this, in the 1920s, especially, were the powerful and influential United Farm Women of Alberta, some of whom held many of the same negative views, not only about home children, but anybody else that they didn't believe meet their standards for immigration and citizenship. In fact, some did not want immigrants who could not afford to live by their own means upon arrival in Canada. nor anybody with any type of disability, and certainly not home children. They expressed concern that such people would, quote, spoil the gene pool of the good British stock, unquote. And like Whitten, they fully supported the Sexual Sterilization Act by the Alberta government in 1928, an act that stayed on the books until 1972. Interestingly, only a few years later, the United Farmers of Alberta, the husbands of the wives who were on the United Farm Women of Alberta, prepared a glowing report about home children, giving high praise to their conduct, work ethic, and skills, especially of the homeboys who had come to this province. In fact, one report said, quote, "Send us more." But it was clearly other voices that were the most damning. With such strong negative views being made so publicly by such prominent people, who would ever want to admit to being a home child? But what was overlooked by those who disparaged the children were the skills, knowledge, accomplishments, education, and types of work in which thousands of the children were employed as adults as early as 1905 and then well into the mid-20th century. Just take a look at some of these: lawyers, ministers, grocers, shopkeepers, managers, nurses, politicians, teachers, businessmen and businesswomen, government employees, entertainers, musicians, office clerks, typists, housewives, telephone operators, servants, and military personnel. Do they fit the image as worthless dregs of society? But it was those cruel and damning words across the years that were far-reaching and heeded by those who listened to rumor and people in power or authority. They attempted to demean and treat with disgust my grandmother and my great-grandmother, excuse me, and every other home child and their parents. Parents who have been unwilling or struggling to give up one or more of their children. Such stigmas were carried forward in Canadian media and communities for years. No wonder the children remained silent, even as adults. Excuse me. Thank you. Thus, for almost the entire history of the child migration scheme, people who had influence chose to focus on their own assumptions, biases, misinformation, and ignorance without looking at other factors or truths. By doing so, they provided justification to those unsure about or already against the children and the organizations. Social media and conspiracy theories were alive and well even that early in our country's history, and it didn't take long for stories to circulate and appear in Canadian media of problems arising with home children. With such strong negative views, again, who would ever want to admit to being a home child? I'm now going to share actual experiences which come from contemporary news articles, legal proceedings, records from children's files, and through interviews, oral histories, and articles and books written by the children themselves as adults telling of their lived history that was almost forgotten. Almost. When there was increased thievery, the blame was often placed on a local home child, whether the allegations were true or not. Home children became the scapegoats for Canadian-born children who were breaking the law or creating mischief. Misinformation about the children became accepted as truths. So how could the children defend themselves or speak on their own behalf? Who would believe them? For some boys and girls, they chose to make a statement in a very personal and final way. Reports began to grow of home children committing suicide, most by hanging, some by gunshot, others by ingesting rat poison or the deadly insecticide Paris green. Intentional drowning was also a way out. The statements of these children came in the form of silence forever by their own hands. We descendants know many of their names, and we shall not keep silent. But what could lead such young children to take such drastic measures to end their own lives? Besides homesickness and loneliness, there are many known reasons that affected just not those that did take their own lives, but many other children as well. Once at their host family, a child was expected to go to work almost immediately, sometimes on the very first day. Rumors circulated that some children were too lazy, too weak, too slow, too sickly, or incapable of the work that the host family expected them to do. And there were always reports of home children being mistreated. What thought was given as to why a child did not know how to milk a cow, plow a field, or harness a horse? What thought was given to the child who, as they grew older, had no proper shoes or clothing, or who slept in the barn and ate the same food as the pigs, or the child who was made to stand outside in the cold winter night with no coat or no shoes, not knowing what he did wrong? Did no one wonder why a home child did not attend school or go to church, or why a child might become severely ill and die? Some neighbors may not have known the horrible conditions in which these children lived. Some of these that did said nothing. Yet others may have thought the child deserved to be treated this way. Perhaps they were treating their own home child no differently. What child, after becoming a parent, would ever want to tell their own children of such a childhood? Were there any discussions as to why a child might run away from their host family, or be afraid to ask for help from a neighbor, or even the local minister? Typically, as we have learned, the child would be told to return to their host family and just be grateful someone had taken them in. It was rare for most children to be accepted as a family member or to be treated as one. If they ate in the family home, it was often in the kitchen by themselves. Then, after cleaning up after everyone and completing their day's chores, return to the attic or barn or the windowless dark room in the dirt-floored basement where they slept. The anticipation of being accepted as a member of the family quickly faded for many. Dreams of acceptance were forgotten. It may be that some of the children who committed suicide or acts of violence against a host family member or a friend of the host family may have thought there was no other way out of the life that they were expected to live. What despair must each of these children have felt? Further, when a child's death was attributed to suicide, or when a death resulted from being beaten or starved, the host family was usually absolved of all blame or received very light sentences. It was often concluded that such actions were brought on by the child themselves and clearly showed weakness of character. Now, the story of George Green is difficult to hear, but it is an important one, for it is a story of disregard, abuse, and negligence. It was well documented in newspapers at the time. George arrived in Canada at the age of 14 in March and was indentured to Helen Finley, a single farmer in her 40s. George was found dead in Finley's home just a few months later. The attending physician described the scene as the worst case of abuse he had ever seen. Here was a small boy covered with a filthy burlap sack and with bruises and marks that were evidence of violence, whippings, beatings, and wounds made by a pitchfork on his starved, emaciated body. George's body was lying on a board in which a round hole had been made to allow urine and waste from his body to drop below. There was so much controversy and different testimony surrounding this case that once it went to court, George's body was exhumed 2 times, with different doctors examining his remains and offering different explanations for his death, all from a decomposing body. In court, Finley had many opinions to explain her dissatisfaction and treatment of George. He was cross-eyed, knock-kneed, an idiot, hard of hearing, slow, lazy, and too short and weak to be doing the type of work she expected. In fact, she said she liked beating George. He deserved the beatings, and she took no responsibility for his death. In the end, the judge could not settle the case, saying there was too much confusing and inconsistent testimony. Finley was released, and her only penalty was that she was not permitted to have any more home children. Abuse, neglect, and suspected manslaughter became justified even through the courts. In 2013, some members of what is now known as Home Children Canada contributed money to lay a memorial stone for George. He is not forgotten. I tell you this story at great length because there are others that are just as horrific. Some were just not as well documented at the time, but those children are also remembered. However, despite all this negativity and despite the cruelty, there was always a segment of the Canadian population that saw beyond the prejudices and the biases and spoke out on behalf of just not the home children, but most other children in Canada. So let's hear about them. Partly because of the treatment of the home children, protective child legislation was enacted and expanded upon. Canadian politicians and social reformers such as John Kelso helped bring about child protection legislation in the 1890s, including the first Children's Aid Society and the Act for the Prevention of Cruelty and the Protection of Children in Canada. A very far-reaching act, but some of which took almost 30 years to develop. The first formal adoption act was enacted in the late 1890s in New Brunswick, and there was one in Ontario in 1921. Similar acts followed in other provinces and territories. Then another important act, the first Child Welfare Act in Canada, passed in 1924, and it was this act that helped lead to the eventual discontinuation of the child migration scheme. Thus, we always must remember there were many kind and thoughtful Canadians who cared about the well-being of the children. They welcomed them and provided good homes and helped them learn other skills and develop interests not related to farm labor or domestic service. There were those who stood by children when they needed support or to be removed from their placement. There was one such person who acted on behalf of my grandmother when she began to be mistreated, and they remained friends for the rest of their lives. There were also a growing number of positive newspaper articles from editors and reporters attempting to provide a favorable and balanced view by identifying and extolling the accomplishments of individuals or small groups of children, including when they were adults. Some of the recognition came during the Great War between 1914 and 1918, in which close to 10,000 children enlisted and 1,200 home children did not return and gave their lives. These are accounts of some who said they enlisted in World War I, in particular with the hopes of finding their families, once back in Great Britain. Most, however, did not. Records were just not available at the time, and most knew very little about their own families to even begin searching. And as most of you know, the Victoria Cross is the highest honor awarded to some individuals who go beyond the call of duty in battle. And 2 British home children were so honored in the Second Battle of Arras, France, between September 2nd and 4th in 1918. Excuse me for a moment. Claude Nunney was killed in action on the 2nd, and Walter Rayfield went on to have a successful life and career in British Columbia. British home child descendants hold these 2 men, but all who served, in high regard. Despite such encouraging and positive reports, the lack of correct knowledge about and the negative attitudes towards home children prevailed within many communities until the beginning of the Second World War, and in some cases, even up to present day, by the uninformed. For example, in 2010, Prime Ministers of Great Britain and Australia apologized to the children under the Child Migration Scheme. However, Jason Kenney, who was Canada's federal immigration minister at the time, was asked by home children and their descendants to represent them to the Prime Minister to ask for an apology to the still living British home children in our country. Kenney's response was that in his 12 years in politics, no one ever brought this history to his attention. And despite this sad circumstance, the government did not offer apologies to every historical situation, particularly when they appeared to be of little interest or importance to Canadians. Yet earlier, the Governor General and the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada both made comments about the importance of recognizing these children and their history. So it may have been Kenney, we're not quite sure, who eventually proposed to the House of Commons to declare 2010 the year of the home child, and who had Canada Post make a design commemorating a stamp. So just so you know, no Prime Minister has offered an apology in Canada, despite being asked to do so twice more since 2010, the most recent being November of 2023. As another example, you might remember former Toronto Mayor Rob Ford, who displayed some questionable behavior that was considered unprofessional when he was in office about 10 to 12 years ago. Well, a Toronto reporter wrote a disparaging article about him and concluded by saying, "What else could you expect from Rob Ford? After all, his grandfather was one of those home children." Well, you can just imagine the number of letters that reporter received from descendants. Now, even though such attitudes continued, when we look back over the years, there was always a long list of host families ready to take the children. Some welcomed them with open arms, and for others, even the youngest of the children were considered only as cheap labor. And if one didn't work out, the host family could always return the child to the sending organization and get another child. And sometimes they even tried to get out of paying for the labor a child had already carried out. In fact, we have records that indicate some host families returned a child to a certain organization when they reached 12, because that was the age that the host family had to begin paying the child wages, the very age my grandmother had to change from being a mother's helper to start working as a servant, even though she had not yet received any training. It was then that she began to be mistreated and finally removed from the host family. We also know that some families asked for another child so they could get out of paying wages for them as well. Thus, because of these and other reasons, many of the children spent their childhood with upwards of 4 or 5 families, and some even more. Again, is it any wonder some children never told their stories, knowing they were so devalued and often not wanted? And so children continued to be sent, but once here, they became very aware they were not always viewed in a good way. It is what they heard, what they saw, what they read, what they were told, and what they lived. It did not take long for them to become disillusioned with their new life. Now, remember the Child Welfare Act of 1924? Well, a clause in this act made it, illegal for any child under the age of 14 to come to Canada without being accompanied by at least one parent. Organizations slowly complied, with some focused on only sending older teens. By 1939, most home children migration ended. However, in 1942 and after World War II, young children, with permission of the Canadian government, continued to be sent to 2 Fairbridge farms, whose patrons were the royal family. Located in British Columbia, these were based not on the receiving and distributing home model, but on the Indian residential school system. Called child migrants because they did not come through receiving homes, Fairbridge children were believed to be the last sent to Canada under the child migration scheme, which finally ended in 1948 here. Recently, however, we have found a few teens sent over by Bernardo's at later dates, though there is always more to learn. In fact, Bernardo's finally closed their Canadian offices in Toronto in 1950. Once migration to Canada declined, some organizations began to send children to Australia, New Zealand, and the former Rhodesia under the same child migration scheme. It finally came to a close overall in 1972. In the end, it lasted 103 years, with approximately 150,000 children being sent to all four countries, with the majority of the children coming to Canada. In fact, we have not fully recorded all who were brought here, and that's why we are now estimating there were, as I mentioned earlier, closer to 115,000 children sent here. This suggests even a greater number of descendants than the estimated 10%. In retrospect, though, although it was promoted that home children would have a better life in Canada, it in fact turned out to be quite different for so many. And why do we know? Because the children started to tell us. Most of the stories were told in later life and sounded very similar. They lived in shame, thought they were not as good as other people, and they believed they were of absolutely no value except as cheap labor. And because they were indentured workers, they were not considered slaves, even though many had been expected to work like one. Thus, with their stories slowly being told, the silence was gradually breaking, and for the most part, it was really hard for the rest of us to hear. And it is because so many experiences were so horrific that even as adults, they said very little and sometimes nothing at all to their own families. Even as a woman in her 80s, Marjorie was afraid the organization who brought her to Canada would come after her and punish her if she spoke out, because she and other children had been told to keep silent about their childhood experience. So, like thousands upon thousands of others, Marjorie kept silent. It became clear why this is a history that was almost forgotten. By the way, Marjorie finally did tell her daughter, but it was after a lot of assurance that nobody would come after her. Through research, we have been able to piece together an extensive history, but the words of the children are the greatest testament to their experiences. Here are some more of those words, thoughts, and memories from those who found the courage to talk about them. Many said they missed out on their schooling, events in the community, and Sunday school or church attendance because of the amount of work they had to do while the family went to church and social outings. Too many home children were considered unworthy to be associating with others. One man who had been placed on a farm in Prince Edward Island told of being beaten every time the family returned from church on Sundays, and again after the family held daily prayer sessions in their home. He slept in the same small shed as the dog and ate whatever food was left over after the dog had its food. Sometimes neither of them ate anything at night. Years later, when asked what he remembered most about being, quote, removed from that hell, unquote, he said, "I stopped being beaten and I got to eat real food." One woman who had also been placed in a home on Prince Edward Island said that the very first Christmas stocking she received in her life was in her new home in Canada. She watched as the children of the family got little dolls, candy, an orange, and little toys. So she was excited when handled a stocking of her own. But to her dismay, it contained only dried out potato peelings and chicken's feet. She was told she was a bad girl, so didn't deserve anything better. She could not hold back the tears and emotions as she told this story over 70 years later. In 1939, Cyril Hewitt was one of the last home children to come to Canada. He thought he was coming to be a cowboy, but that was not to be his future. Instead, his childhood was one of harsh conditions and hard farm labor. He said, quote, "Nobody cared about us homeboys. Animals were treated better. The family dogs were treated better," unquote. There were so many who said that they did not know how to be a parent or how to make friends because they had never had much opportunity to interact with others outside of their host families, and sometimes not even with them. They grew to be fond of animals because it was with them they spent most of their time. One woman, I will call her Mary, did not want her name to be known when she first told her story, as she didn't want her children to know about what happened to her as a child. Mary said she was 12 when placed with a farmer and his wife. She was both the hired hand and the house servant, so worked many hours each day. Sometimes the farmer would get angry with her and beat her over her head and across her back. The farmer's wife would also slap her or beat her. Mary said most of the time she did not know what she did wrong. She would often go to sleep with her clothes on in an attempt to deter the farmer from raping her. It was not always successful, as he held his hand across her mouth so she could not call out. Although Mary did not become pregnant, research has shown us that many home girls did as young as 12 and 13, and often within a year after they arrived. Mary was finally removed from that home, but not before the beatings caused a permanent spinal injury. Most who were interviewed said they missed not knowing who or where their families were, and that they would have liked to have had or met or seen their siblings again, and especially one of their parents, no matter what the circumstances had been that had led them to give up their children. Thus, what we have recognized in many of these children as they became parents is the same type of intergenerational gap and trauma that we have seen in families whose children went to Indian residential schools. In fact, many descendants feel great affinity and have great compassion for Indigenous families because of the strong similarities in how children and their families were devalued, disregarded, and mistreated. Finally, there is George Mackey, who was in his 70s when he said this to the interviewer, quote, "We were the cheapest slave labor the farmers ever had. I was wondering how you even got to thinking of such people as us. I thought we were long forgotten, as we were only homeboys, and it didn't matter much about what happened to us. We were of no importance," unquote. Excuse me, I always get emotional at this point. His words seem to speak across the years and echo the thoughts and silent voices of the thousands of children who felt and believed the same. Overall, the plight of so many of these children from Britain was awful. Most of the stories we have came from people well into their 70s and 80s, and they openly wept, even the men, as they let loose years of hidden memories and emotions. In fact, my grandmother was one who told her story in this way, but not to her children or us, her grandchildren. Instead, she told it to her nephew, and he told it to me long after my grandmother passed away. Perhaps it is just as well, because I might not have been ready for such revelations in my younger years. There are other stories, good stories, not nearly enough though, but they help ease the pain of those that were not so nice, that were horrible, or that were utterly tragic. Here are a few. Cecilia Jowett, who came to Canada in 1901, had a good upbringing with the family and had a successful nursing career. She later wrote a book of her life and told this insightful yet ironic story. Quote, I have heard ladies say, oh, I'd never take a child like that into my home. You never know how they will turn out. And there I was, a graduate nurse in their homes, rendering skilled assistance, perhaps saving or helping to save a life. Yet they didn't dream that I was one of those children once, unquote. Meet Charlie Young. He grew up on a farm with a family who also treated him well and with whom he and his own family maintained a close relationship throughout his life. He left the farm and became an RCMP, working his way through the ranks. A highlight of his career was when Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip visited Canada for the first time, and he was on their security detail when they arrived in British Columbia. His daughter, who wrote a book about him, said that she had the best bring your parents to school days because nobody else could show off a father who rode in the same car as the future queen. James Rennicks came from Glasgow and grew up working on a farm near Perth, Ontario. When his indenture ended, he decided to upgrade his education, and he went off to university in Toronto, then became a lawyer. He was later named a judge to the Provincial Court of Ontario. And closer to home, Peter Ashby came from the west or from the east to Edmonton and became a member of Parliament for the Social Credit Party in the late 40s. Nick Hodson was born in Russia, but came to Canada as a home child after his family moved to Great Britain and experienced great hardships. He settled in Collingwood, Ontario, and became a well-known local and international artist. Then there is home child Ken Donovan, who became one of the managers in the government department that came to be known as Supply and Services Canada, a rather significant position. It was his 19-year-old daughter, Joan, however, who gained some fame. In 1964, as you know, Canada held a competition for the design of our own flag. Until then, we had been flying both the Union Jack and the Red Ensign. Once a winner had been declared, Prime Minister Pearson asked Ken to have a flag made, and he wanted it to be delivered to his home the next morning. Well, this was Friday at noon, so Ken called several silkscreen artists and directed each of them to create one piece of the flag. Then, once completed, Ken took all the prepared sections and asked his daughter Joan to sew them together. Well, Joan was a recently married 19-year-old who was just teaching herself to sew. So it was several hours before she finally handed over the very first maple leaf flag to her father, and Ken got it into the hands of the Prime Minister on time by 10 o'clock Saturday morning. Pearson then flew it at his home before bringing it into the House of Commons the following Monday, February 15th, 1965, where our flag was inaugurated and officially raised for the first time. Now, Joan Donovan O'Malley has become a hero in the home child history and has been honored at many of Canada's anniversaries of the flag. In fact, the 60th anniversary is only a few months away in February. Now, not to be overlooked is Joan's Singer sewing machine. It also gets some recognition. It's on display in the Canadian Museum of History. And now I introduce you to the last known living British home children in Canada. Two of them, George Beardshaw, who turned 101 on September 14th and now lives in London, Ontario, and Albert Middleton, who lives in Vancouver, and he will be turning 109 in January of 2025. George is the last surviving member of the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada, who served in World War II and who was present at the liberation of France. In 2022, George, even though he is Canadian, received the Medal of Honor from the French government for his war service, the equivalent of being knighted, and he now bears the title Sir. His words as a home child, however, are not as wonderful. He spoke for many when he recently said, quote, "It's like we never existed," unquote. Sir George has been interviewed many times, and his words and memories are some of the last oral testament we have to Canada's British home child experience and history. Finally, I want you to meet this beautiful little girl, Amelia Louisa Newton. She came to Canada at the age of 10 in 1884, following the death of her mother. She was a single child. She was immediately adopted into a prominent family, the Thompsons, in Thornhill, Ontario, who raised her as their own daughter. Amelia, and later her own family, maintained a close relationship with the Thompsons. Amelia did not become famous, nor did she do something extraordinary to make her stand out amongst others. Instead, her story is one in which a home child was accepted, respected, and loved. I am always so proud of home children, community and nation builders. They are resilient survivors, creators. So many left a lasting mark on the Canadian landscape and in our history. And I sometimes wonder, somewhat cynically, what the majority of naysayers such as Nichols, Clark, the United Farm Women of Alberta, Whitten, and all of those other unkind individuals would think about the thousands upon thousands of home children who have proven their biased views so wrong. Finally, besides Joan Donovan O'Malley, there are also some other child descendants whose grandfathers were British home children. Don Cherry from Hockey Canada, Doug Ford, as you know, Rob Ford's brother, the current Premier of Ontario, and former Bloc Québécois leader Gilles Duceppe. In fact, Mr. Duceppe, whose grandfather was a home child from Ireland, was instrumental in helping the British home children descendants obtain an apology from the Canadian House of Commons in 2017. Now, despite the negativity and the stigma felt by most for a lifetime, these children persevered. Some remained single, but most married and raised families. Some moved to different parts of Canada, some to the United States, and some returned to the United Kingdom. But what is significant is that they all contributed to the building of their communities and this nation. In fact, when I learn about home children who lived in or near or are buried in cemeteries in the communities in which I give presentations, I like to mention them and honor them in my presentations. And here are just a few in the Red Deer area and in central Alberta. There are more. I just have to do more research. Winifred Emily, maiden name Brown, Brooks, and Sydney Ernest Brown from Red Deer. Albert Francis Proudler of Caroline, and Thomas George Warner of Red Deer. Thomas Gordon Jessup from Rimbey, and Walter McCormick from Innisfail. Alex Gertrude Priest in Ponoka, and Herbert Christopher Brown in Mirror. Robert Cameron and Norman Christie from Stettler. Martin Frederick, Rocky Mountain House. William Seth from Castor. Charlotte McGregor Davy and William McKendrick Davy are in Hewenden. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. And George West from Forestburg, and William Hanrahan from Daysland. Overall, most children left behind as their legacy their children, and their children, and their children, descendants who continue to make a difference in Canada today. In fact, I ask you to try to imagine the number of people in Canada who are or were directly and indirectly related to just one home child, Think about them: siblings, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, a sister-in-law, a brother-in-law, a nephew or niece. Now consider the spouse and the number of cousins of a descendant of a home child. Imagine millions upon millions, including perhaps some of you in this room who have no idea of your connection to this history. Now take a look at some of the known places where home children are buried or lived in Alberta. And each year, as we approach British Home Child Day in September, a growing number of descendants go to hundreds of cemeteries in these locations and elsewhere throughout the country. And we lay a flower, usually a sunflower, on the grave of a home child, excluding ones we do not know, as a token of respect and a reminder that they are remembered, and as a sign that we are breaking their silence. So what has been done to help others learn about the British home child history? There are several monuments and plaques at sites where receiving homes used to be. They are also found near the former Bernardo Training Farm in Russell, Manitoba, and Fairbridge Farm in Duncan, British Columbia, Pier 21 in Halifax, and a unique monument in Park Lawn Cemetery in Toronto, bearing the names of 72 children, overlooking a large series of unmarked graves where these children were buried. But just to be assured, we know their names. But the most significant of all is in Peterborough, Ontario, where at Hazelbury, the Bernardo Home for Girls used to stand. These large, polished granite blocks are etched with the names of over 9,000 girls that passed through this receiving home, and my grandmother's name is one of them. And now the names on this monument have actually been put into a special collection on the British genealogical site, Find My Past. Now, what else promotes awareness? Research, books, articles in newspapers, newsletters, and scholarly journals. All media, including radio, television, videos, and documentaries, many of which are on YouTube. As well, Library and Archives Canada and Veterans Affairs Canada each have home child records that can be researched online. There are research groups, presentations, special displays in libraries and museums, and special events commemorating the children. Finally, some school boards in Southern Ontario and Nova Scotia, and I believe in some places in British Columbia, have added this history to their elementary school curriculum. And we want to see this history in every school curriculum across the country, and just not added, but actually being taught. Now, there are 4 recent important dates I bring to your attention. First, 2010. As mentioned earlier, the Canadian government issued a home child stamp and declared 2010 the year of the home child. 2017 was the year when the House of Commons offered a formal apology to the home children and their descendants. The Prime Minister approved of it, but did not sit that day. In 2018, the House of Commons declared September 28th as British Home Child Day in Canada. And the final date is 2019, the year the British government awarded the equivalent of $30,000 Canadian to each child who was part of the child migration scheme and who was still alive in 2018. Now, most of that money went to Australia because just a handful of those that had come to Canada were still alive. However, they did agree to give that money to descendants of a Canadian who had still been alive, but who may have died in that year or just after. Now, 2010 was also the 150th year since the first group of home children arrived in Canada, and we celebrated all year long. Called the Beacons of Light, the highlights of the commemoration coincided with National British Home Child Day. This photo is of the major electrical company in Glasgow, Scotland, that celebrated with us to represent children who came from Scotland. And we continue to celebrate each year. Some of us give presentations, some mayors across the country, including your mayor, Ken Johnston, proclaimed today, September 28th, as National British Home Child Day in their cities. And tonight, your city hall will be illuminated in the home children colors of red, white, and blue. These are the colors of the Union Jack under which all children settled. Well done, Red Deer. You are one of the most significant supporters in Canada on this British Home Child Day. So good for you. There are other events held at religious and educational institutions, local governments and in cities, towns, and businesses in Canada and Great Britain, and this year, 2024, in Australia. British home child flags are flown, prayers are said in churches, buildings and homes, including mine and my brother's in Ontario, and they are lit up overnight. Proclamations are announced, presentations continue to be made, and there is a growing media coverage. We are even highlighted in the British magazine, Who Do You Think You Are? To further recognize the children, the Canadian Museum of History created a British Home Child exhibit, and the Upper Canada Board of Education in Toronto created a home child section in their online library guide for students. I was informed that my master's thesis, They Were But Children, is recommended reading. So that gave me the incentive to continue writing articles, carry out more research, and begin doing presentations. I gave my first one in 2019, and it lasted 35 minutes. I now sometimes go over 2 hours. In fact, this is my 6th presentation, excuse me, this year, and my 25th overall. And I have more planned in the next few months, and also have an international one in February. So I'm quite excited. But there is something also that I'd like to share that was personal about the 2019 commemoration. Excuse me, that year, I wrote some articles, arranged a proclamation, and some illuminations and several memorials. But one of my favorite experiences was when I contacted the town council in my grandmother's hometown of Bungay, Suffolk, England. I told them of her story and explained the home children history and that we were commemorating the 150 years. They got back to me indicating the town would light up their famous 1,200-year-old castle ruins to honor one of their own who had been taken from them. But then I got a call from a newspaper reporter in Bungay asking for an interview. It was 10:30 in the morning his time, but 3:30 in the morning my time. But not an opportunity is to be missed to spread the word. So of course I did the interview. And he placed his well-written article in 5 British newspapers and international genealogical sites. It was well worth being awake that time of the morning. And so it goes on. Thousands of descendants continue to research these special children. It has often been emotional and frustrating, but always exciting and worthwhile. And although many of our British home child ancestors lived with shame, we honor and respect them by ensuring their stories are told and their unique place in Canadian history is forgotten no longer. The children are silenced no more. And my grandmother's story? Grace's father, my great-grandfather, Harry Charles Sillett, died in 1899 at the age of 38 of throat cancer, leaving my pregnant great-grandmother, Margaret, with 7 children under the age of 10. There were no other family members who could help them out, and she could not cope on her own financially. Almost immediately, the local poor law committee stepped in and assisted with a small amount of money. However, shortly after, they decided Margaret was not a fit parent and cut her off. They gave her the choice of having the entire family put into the workhouse or giving up 4 of her children. After 6 months of continued hardships, she finally and reluctantly gave up her 4 middle daughters, not realizing she would never see 3 of them again. It was June of 1900. My grandmother, who was not yet 8, was one of those 4. She was sent to Barnardo's, then sent to live with an elderly couple outside of London for 2 years to prepare her for Canada. When she was 10, Grace was returned to Barnardo's, and within a few weeks after, she was sent sail for Canada, arriving in the fall of 1902. Within days, she was taken to Brighton, Ontario, where she remained until she married my grandfather in 1914. Although she was placed with 4 families in 8 years, 2 placements were very brief, just weeks, and one of those was in the summer. Grace was sent to live in the country with an elderly friend of one of her host families. It was only temporary in order to remove her from what was recorded in her file as, quote, bad influences. Apparently, my 16-year-old granny had begun to ask too many questions about boys. Grace's indenture ended at the age of 18, and rather than going to work as a domestic, she chose to become one of the earliest telephone operators in the village of Brighton. And what I have learned about the rest of her life is fascinating. I was privileged to have known her. I don't know why my grandmother was the only one of her siblings to be sent to Canada, but because she was, I am able to stand before you today, sharing a small part of her story and the history of so many more of this unique group of children. Thank you for your attention.